The waiting room outside the courtroom was unusually quiet for a place filled with so many people. Lawyers moved in and out, speaking in hushed tones. A few reporters stood near the hallway, holding notepads but unsure whether they were allowed to speak. But in one corner of the room, the tension felt different. It didn't come from legal documents or strategy discussions. It came from a 6-year-old girl who hadn't spoken more than a handful of words in nearly a month. Emily sat on a cushioned bench, her legs barely dangling over the edge. Her hands were tightly gripping the leash of a golden retriever named Max, who sat loyally by her feet. The dog was calm but alert, his head occasionally turning at the sound of passing footsteps. Max wasn't just any dog, he was a specially trained therapy and trauma response dog from a local canine support program. But to Emily, he was much more than that. He was her protector, her friend, and the only one who seemed to understand her. Silence. Emily's mother, Corinne, sat beside her eyes tired and filled with worry. She gently brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's face, but Emily didn't look up. She hadn't been the same since that terrible night. There had been investigations, doctors, interviews, and finally, this court case. Today was supposed to be the day Emily would testify. Everyone knew it wouldn't be easy. Emily hadn't even spoken to the prosecutor. Her only words, if any, were always whispered to Max. Max had been with the family for just a few months, but he had bonded with Emily almost instantly. On his first day home, he had laid beside her bed for hours without moving. That night, when Emily woke up screaming from a nightmare, Max jumped onto the bed, placed his head on her chest, and stayed there until she fell asleep again. It became a pattern. Max never left her side. Wherever she went, he went. Whenever she froze, Max responded. Outside the courtroom door, a child advocate approached. She knelt to Emily's level and spoke in a soft, careful voice. "Hi, Emily, sweetheart. Are you ready to come inside with Max? You don't have to say anything if you don't want to. Just hold Max's leash, okay?" Emily blinked slowly, then nodded once. She looked down at Max and leaned in close, her mouth near his ear. Nobody else could hear what she said, her voice was too soft. But Max's reaction was immediate. He sat up straighter, his ears perked, and his eyes sharpened toward the courtroom door. He didn't bark or growl. He just went still, completely focused. Corinne noticed the shift. "Emily, what did you say to Max?" But Emily didn't answer. She just placed her small hand on Max's head and stood up. The leash tightened in her grip, and for a second, the tension in the hallway seemed to melt. This little girl, who hadn't spoken to her own mother about the incident, was about to enter a courtroom filled with strangers. And her only defense, her only comfort, was the dog at her side. The bailiff opened the door and gave a nod. Emily took a breath, and with Max walking in step beside her, she entered the courtroom. Inside, the judge looked up. A prosecutor stood ready. The defendant sat motionless, staring across the room. Nobody could have guessed that a single whispered word to a dog was about to turn the entire trial upside down. What happened next would leave everyone speechless. As the tall courtroom doors slowly shut behind them, all eyes turned to the little girl walking hand in hand with a golden retriever. Emily's steps were small and careful, but each one was steady. Her fingers gripped Max's leash with quiet determination. The judge, a stern-looking man in his 60s, adjusted his glasses and glanced at the papers in front of him. Then he looked directly at the girl. "Is this the witness with the service dog?" he asked. "Yes, Your Honor," replied the prosecutor. "A composed woman named Dana Reyes. Her name is Emily Walters. The dog's name is Max. He's a registered trauma response canine." The judge raised an eyebrow. Is there a handler present? I am, came a soft voice from the back. A woman in a gray blazer stepped forward. Sarah Moore. I'm Max's certified canine handler and trainer. I'll be available for questions. The judge nodded slowly. Very well. The court will allow the dog to remain by the witness's side, provided he remains calm and under control. Max sat beside Emily's feet, not making a sound. But his posture said everything. He was alert, protective, and focused on one person in the room, the defendant. The man sat across the courtroom, expression unreadable. He didn't blink as Emily took her seat at the witness stand. Emily didn't. Look at him. She looked at Max. The prosecutor approached gently, her tone warm. Hi, Emily. Do you remember me? I'm Dana. We met with your mom a few weeks ago. I just want to ask you a few questions, okay? You don't have to say anything, if you don't want to. Emily said nothing. She placed one hand on Max's back and the other on her lap. The room was dead quiet. Dana crouched slightly. You can also talk to Max if that helps. Is that okay? A few seconds passed, then Emily leaned forward. She didn't look at the courtroom. She didn't look at Dana. Instead, she brought her lips close to Max's ear again and whispered something so low only he could hear. Max stiffened. He didn't bark. He didn't whine. But slowly, his head turned toward the defendant and his eyes locked on him. Max's body became still as stone. Then came the sound that made everyone freeze. A growl. Low, deep, controlled, but unmistakable. The judge looked up sharply. Dana stood still. The jury leaned forward in their seats. The tension in the room felt like it could snap. Emily, for the first time in front of all those strangers, opened her mouth and spoke just 2 words. He remembers. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but the meaning landed like thunder. The judge leaned forward. Excuse me, young lady? Emily didn't repeat herself. She just kept her hand gently on Max's fur. Max didn't growl louder. He didn't lunge or bark. But he didn't stop staring. The defendant shifted slightly in his seat, adjusting his tie, but his eyes had changed. The confidence that had been there all morning was gone. The prosecutor cleared her throat. Your Honor, I believe it would be helpful to briefly pause the questioning and allow Max's trainer to explain the dog's training and response behavior for context. Granted, the judge said immediately. Sarah Moore walked to the stand, holding a binder. Max was trained to respond to specific emotional triggers and coded words from trauma victims. He is trained to identify fear, threat, and changes in behavior. The word scared is one of his trigger cues. If that word is whispered by a child in distress, he will go into alert mode and visually identify the perceived source of that fear. The judge looked at Emily. Miss Emily, did you say something to Max just now? Emily nodded once. What did you say? Emily looked down at her dog and whispered again, but loud enough for everyone to hear. I said scared. And Max's growl deepened, never breaking eye contact with the man across the room. A long, uneasy silence filled the courtroom as Max's low growl echoed in the space. No one moved. No one even breathed. The jury sat frozen, their eyes locked on the dog who refused to blink. Emily remained seated, her fingers gripping his fur, while the judge leaned back in his chair, visibly unsettled. Even seasoned officers near the back of the courtroom shifted uneasily, watching the golden retriever like he had become something more than a service animal. He had become a witness. The defendant, Robert Kinley, adjusted the cuffs of his suit and attempted to maintain his composure. But something in his expression had shifted. He was no longer relaxed. His posture had stiffened. His eyes flicked to Max, then to the little girl beside him, then quickly away. The judge cleared his throat and addressed Sarah Moore. Max's handler. Is this a common behavior from the dog in court? Sarah shook her head. No, Your Honor. Max has been present in dozens of trauma hearings. He's never reacted like this, not once. He only becomes alert like this when a specific trigger. Word is used in association with a genuine emotional response. This isn't aggression. This is identification. He's doing exactly what he was trained to do. The judge raised his eyebrows. Identification? Yes, Sarah said calmly. He's identifying the source of the child's fear. The words hit the courtroom like a dropped glass. Dana Reyes, the prosecutor, stood again and approached the bench. Your Honor, I move to allow Max's behavior into the court record as part of the child's testimony. While it may not be verbal, it is a trained, conditioned response backed by expert certification. The defense attorney quickly rose. Objection, Your Honor. This is a courtroom, not a television show. We cannot allow the behavior of an animal. To influence a jury's opinion, the judge held up his hand to silence the room. Sit down, Mr. Trent. This is highly unusual, but I agree the dog's training and the child's relationship to it deserve consideration. We will allow limited questioning about the dog's response under expert supervision. Mr. Trent returned to his seat, clearly frustrated. Robert Kinley leaned in and whispered something to him, his tone quiet but sharp. Meanwhile, Emily hadn't looked up once. She sat in the witness chair, one hand still gently rubbing Max's back. She looked small in the oversized seat, but somehow stronger than she had been just minutes before. Her lips parted. He growled at him last time too, she said softly. Everyone turned. Dana took a step closer. Emily, do you mean he growled at that man before? Emily nodded slowly. That night. The judge leaned forward. Miss Walters, are you saying your dog was present the night of the incident? Emily's voice was no louder than a whisper. Yes, he hid with me in the closet. When the door opened, Max growled. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Several jurors looked visibly shaken. The prosecutor kept her voice calm. Emily, did you see who opened the closet door? Emily didn't answer. She reached down and held Max's collar tighter. Her lips trembled, but then she nodded slowly and pointed straight at Robert Kinley. He did, she said. Kinley's face went pale. His lawyer stood again to object, but the damage was done. The energy in the room had changed. This wasn't just a frightened child anymore. This was a survivor, backed by a highly trained companion who had just confirmed her truth in the only way he could. Max stood up slowly and moved a step forward. The judge signaled a bailiff, but Max didn't advance. He simply stood between Emily and the defendant, silent, steady, and unblinking. For the first time that day, Robert Kinley looked afraid. The tension in the courtroom clung to every corner like fog. After Emily's quiet accusation and Max's silent stance, the judge called for a short recess. As jurors filed out, murmuring in disbelief, the bailiff motioned for Emily and Max to step out as well. Emily walked with Max at her side, her posture more upright than when she had first entered. It was subtle, but clear. She felt protected. She wasn't alone. In the hallway, Dana Reyes stood with Sarah Moore and the court-appointed child advocate. Karen, Emily's mother, hurried to her daughter and knelt down. Are you okay, sweetheart? She whispered, tears already forming. In her eyes, Emily looked up, nodded once, and whispered, Max knew. Sarah watched the girl quietly, then turned to Dana. You should hear what Max was trained to do. I think the jury should too. Back inside, after the recess, the courtroom reassembled with a new intensity. The judge adjusted his robe and called Sarah Moore back to the stand. Miss Moore, the judge said, please explain Max's training in full. This court needs to understand exactly what we're witnessing. Sarah nodded and opened her binder. Max is part of a trauma-informed canine program developed for child abuse and PTSD victims. He's trained to respond to specific verbal cues and behavioral changes in children. The word scared is one of his primary triggers. Trigger? The judge asked. When a child under his care says that word with elevated emotion, Max is conditioned to enter alert mode. He immediately becomes focused, protective, and watches for potential threats. He's not trained to attack, just to observe and identify. Dana stepped forward. And in Emily's case, what did he identify? Sarah glanced toward the defense table. He identified the defendant, twice. A gasp swept the gallery. The defense attorney stood. Objection. Speculation. The judge held up a hand again. Overruled for now. Continue, Miss Moore. Max reacted to the word scared in the hallway, and again in the courtroom when Emily spoke. Both times his eyes locked onto Mr. Kinley. He didn't react to anyone else, not even me. Dana asked, "Has Max ever had a false response in court?" "Never," Sarah said firmly. "He's worked with over 20 child witnesses in active investigations. His reactions have always aligned with either physical evidence or confessions." The courtroom fell silent. Dana walked slowly back to her table, then turned. "Your Honor, we are prepared to submit Max's training documentation and handler certifications into evidence." The judge nodded. "Accepted. The jury will review the documents as part of testimony." Robert Kinley's face had gone stiff, jaw clenched, his fingers tapping nervously against the table. His lawyer leaned over, whispering urgently, but Kinley didn't move. His stare was fixed on the dog, still sitting like a statue, still watching him. Then Emily was brought back in. She walked calmly to the witness stand. This time, she didn't hesitate. Max sat beside her. The judge gently asked, "Emily, do you feel okay to speak again?" She nodded. Double quotes. "Can you tell us how you felt that night?" Emily took a shaky breath. "I was hiding in the closet with Max. The door opened and he growled, just like today." "And who was at the door?" She pointed again, voice barely above a whisper. "Him." This time, no one questioned her. The judge sat quietly for a moment, then addressed the courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I want to remind you that you are to weigh all testimony, verbal or otherwise, with care and fairness. But make no mistake, this court recognizes the credibility of a trained trauma response dog and the powerful role it has played today." As Emily stepped down, Max at her side, the room remained silent. For the first time in the trial, the courtroom felt something more than tension. It felt the truth creeping in, and it wasn't finished yet. As the courtroom door shut behind Emily and Max, a long pause followed. The judge leaned back in his chair, quietly flipping through notes. The jury sat motionless, several numbers still visibly shaken. The atmosphere had completely changed. The tension hadn't lessened. It had grown heavier, more charged. But now it carried something else. Belief. Across the room, Robert Kinley could feel it too. The confidence he had exuded at the start of the trial was fading, replaced by something colder. His hands, once folded calmly, now fidgeted beneath the table. He glanced sideways at his lawyer, who whispered something, but Kinley didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the door through which the girl and her dog had just exited. Dana Reyes stood, slowly and deliberately. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to introduce new evidence previously held for corroboration, based on today's testimony." "Proceed," the judge said. Dana walked to the jury, holding a small envelope. "This is a time-stamped home security video clip from the Walters residence. It shows a portion of the night in question. Audio is minimal, but visual cues may be significant. The court has already reviewed and cleared the video for privacy." She turned to the technician. who played the footage on a screen visible to the courtroom. The video flickered to life. The living room appeared quiet. Nighttime. Dim light. Then a shadow moved near the hallway. A tall male figure entered the framed face. Partially obscured, but size and posture unmistakably similar to the defendant's. The figure moved toward the back of the house. A few seconds later, a faint sound, a low growl barely audible, but there. Then the figure paused, looked over his shoulder, and left the frame. The screen went black. The room was silent. One of the jurors, an older woman, blinked hard and looked away. Another juror leaned forward, eyes narrowed. Dana turned to the judge. We believe this moment was when Max growled from the closet. It stopped him. Emily had said that Max growled that night. The behavior was consistent, both then and today. The defense attorney stood abruptly. Your Honor, the footage is inconclusive. The individual's face is not fully visible. This could be anyone. Dana stepped forward again. And yet the child recognized him. The dog reacted. The timeline matches. And the only person in this courtroom who seems uncomfortable is the defendant. The judge looked down at the defense table. Mr. Kinley, would you care to respond? Robert Kinley stood slowly. His suit, once pristine, now looked wrinkled at the collar. He cleared his throat. I wasn't there that night. I don't know what anyone thinks they saw. I had no reason to. But his voice faltered. His eyes darted toward the jury, then toward the back of the courtroom. He reached for his water glass with a shaking hand. Dana didn't need to say anything else. The moment had spoken for itself. The judge exhaled and turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, we will take a brief recess before continuing testimony. Please return in 30 minutes. As the courtroom emptied, Dana looked through the glass panel in the hallway door. Emily sat outside with Max, her head resting gently on the dog's shoulder. Corinne sat beside her, wiping tears from her eyes. Max, as always, sat completely still, watchful, calm, and fiercely loyal. Inside, the defense attorney leaned in to whisper to Kinley, his tone now edged with urgency. You need to be honest with me right now. How much do they really know? Kinley didn't answer. He was too busy staring at the door, where Max had last stood. For the first time, he wasn't worried about the jury. He wasn't worried about the lawyers. He was worried about a dog who couldn't speak, but who had said everything. 30 minutes later, the jury returned to the box, and the tension, if anything, had grown thicker. Reporters had taken their seats in the gallery. The camera band lifted just enough to allow sketch artists and journalists inside. Word was spreading something unusual. Something powerful was unfolding in courtroom 4B. And at the center of it all was a 6-year-old girl and a golden retriever who hadn't said a word, but had told an entire story. Emily and Max returned to the witness stand. This time she walked taller. Her steps were still careful, but no longer hesitant. Max followed beside her, every movement smooth and deliberate. The judge leaned slightly forward, elbows resting on the bench. Dana stood again. Emily, thank you for being so brave. I know it's hard, but can I ask you one more question? Emily looked up, nodded faintly, and placed her hand on Max's head. Do you remember what happened after the closet door opened? Emily blinked. She didn't speak right away. Her small fingers stroked Max's ear. Then, quietly, she said, I closed my eyes. And then? Emily hesitated. Then something changed in her face. A flicker of clarity passed through her expression. I heard him whisper my name. He said, don't scream. But Max growled really loud. Dana's voice remained steady. Was it the same voice as the man you saw in this courtroom? Emily slowly nodded and pointed again. Yes, it was him. Max gave a soft huff and pressed his head into Emily's lap. The courtroom sat in stunned silence. Dana turned to the judge. Your Honor, at this time, we'd like to recall Officer Travis Hayes, the first responder on the scene that night. The officer took the stand, nodding solemnly at Emily as he passed. Officer Hayes, did you find any sign of forced entry when you arrived at the Walters residence? No, he replied. There were no broken windows or doors. It looked like someone had been let in or had a key. Donna continued, and who had access to the Walters home? Family, close friends, and one neighbor who is often called to help with babysitting or errands. She nodded. Please name that neighbor. Robert Kinley. A quiet murmur rose in the gallery. Dana turned toward the jury. So the defendant had access. No sign of forced entry was found, and the only witness with a clear emotional response to the event Max reacted to him. The defense attorney jumped to his feet. Circumstantial. This is all built on emotion and speculation. But he was drowned out by the softest of voices. He stepped on Max's paw. Everyone turned. Emily sat still, looking down. What did you say, Emily? Dana asked. That night, in the closet, when Max growled, the man kicked him and stepped on his paw. Max didn't bark. He just stayed with me? Dana looked at Officer Hayes. Were there any signs of injury on the dog when you arrived? The officer nodded slowly. There was slight swelling on his front paw, but we were too focused on Emily to note it. Suddenly, the courtroom began seeing everything through a new lens. Not just what Emily remembered, but what Max had endured silently. The growl, the protectiveness, the focus on the defendant. It wasn't only loyalty. It was memory. A witness with no voice had carried the truth in his instincts. And now, Emily had remembered what he never forgot. Robert Kinley was pale, breathing heavily. His lawyer whispered furiously, but Kinley shook his head. He looked straight ahead, but he wasn't seeing the judge or the jury. He was seeing Max, and Max was still watching him. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted from cautious doubt to a quiet conviction that something very real was unfolding. It wasn't just the testimony anymore. It was the way Emily sat, no longer shrinking in her seat, and the way Max continued to guard her without flinching. For many in the room, including members of the jury, it had become impossible to deny that truth was being spoken, not just by the child, but by the dog who never left her side. Dana Reyes stood once more and looked toward the judge. Your Honor, at this time the prosecution rests. The judge nodded and turned to the defense. Mr. Trent? The defense attorney rose reluctantly. He looked more tired than he had that morning, his voice flatter, less forceful. The defense will call no witnesses. A ripple of surprise passed through the courtroom. The judge blinked. You're choosing not to cross-examine the witness again? No rebuttal? No character witnesses? Trent hesitated, then said, No, Your Honor. Dana turned toward the jury, eyes calm but firm. Then, with permission, I'd like to proceed with closing arguments. The judge gave a nod. Proceed. Dana walked slowly toward the jury box. Her voice was clear, steady, and without theatrics. Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard from experts. You've seen security footage. You've listened to the only witness brave enough to relive the most terrifying night of her life, a child. But you've also seen something just as powerful. You saw a dog, trained to protect, react in a way that can't be rehearsed, faked, or staged. She paused and looked around the courtroom. Max never barked wildly. He didn't attack. He didn't panic. He did what he was trained to do. He identified fear, locked onto the threat, and stayed between his girl and danger. And when she whispered that one word, he confirmed what her heart never stopped knowing. She was scared. Of him, Dana pointed. Across the room. Robert Kinley had access to the house. He was trusted by the family. He knew the layout. He knew when Emily's parents were away. He didn't need to break in. He just needed a reason. And when Max stopped him in that hallway, just like he stopped him here today, that's when everything changed. She took a breath and then said, "Sometimes the most powerful testimony doesn't come from the loudest voice. Sometimes it comes from the quietest courage, and sometimes from a growl." She returned to her seat. The judge looked to the defense one final time, but Mr. Trent simply shook his head, defeated. With that, the judge turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, I will now instruct you to begin deliberations." The jury rose and exited the courtroom. Emily watched them go, holding Max's collar with one hand and her mother's with the other. Corinne leaned down and whispered, "You did it, baby. No matter what happens, you were amazing." Emily didn't speak. She simply reached down, hugged Max tightly around his neck, and whispered something into his fur. Max let out a soft exhale, as if he understood every word. 37 minutes later, the jury returned. Everyone stood. The judge asked, "Have you reached a verdict?" The jury foreman, a middle-aged man with silver glasses and kind eyes, stood. "We have, Your Honor." He handed a paper to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. The judge glanced at the verdict, then read it aloud. "In the matter of the State versus Robert Kinley, on account of aggravated child endangerment, we find the defendant guilty." The room erupted not in noise, but in emotion. Corinne gasped and hugged Emily tightly. Dana closed her eyes, tears threatening to fall. Even Officer Hayes gave a quiet nod. Robert Kinley slumped in his chair, his expression hollow. Max? He simply sat, watching him. Calm. Certain. As if he had known all along. The judge's gavel struck once, sharp and final, echoing through the courtroom. As the verdict was read, guilty, Robert Kinley remained seated, his body slumped, eyes vacant. His hands twitched at his sides, but he didn't protest. He didn't look at the jury. He didn't even look at Emily. He knew it was over. Emily sat quietly in her chair, her small hands gently rubbing the fur behind Max's ears. She didn't smile. She didn't cry, but something in her had changed. For the first time since that terrible night, her face no longer held fear. It held peace. Corinne bent down, tears in her eyes, and kissed the top of her daughter's head. "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart. You did something so brave." Emily glanced up at her mom, then looked down at Max, who was now laying calmly at her feet. "Max did it too," she whispered. The judge cleared his throat and addressed the courtroom. "Before I dismiss the jury, I want to acknowledge the courage of the young witness and the extraordinary role of her service dog. Justice was served today because of them both. Court is adjourned." The sound of benches sliding and shuffling feet filled the room. Reporters rushed to the hallway. The prosecutor's team embraced quietly. But Emily and Max didn't move right away. The little girl leaned down and hugged him tightly around his neck, whispering something only he could hear. He closed his eyes and let out a soft breath, pressing his nose into her chest. The courtroom bailiff approached, smiling gently. "You know, young lady, I've seen a lot of people testify over the years. Grown men, police officers. But no one's done what you just did. That was real courage." Emily looked up at him, then down at Max. "He wasn't just helping me," she said quietly. "He remembered it too." The words settled in the air like truth carved in stone. Outside the courthouse, reporters had already gathered, cameras flashing. Corinne quickly shielded Emily from the attention, but Donna Reyes stepped in and spoke firmly to the press. "The verdict today represents more than a legal victory. It represents what happens when we believe survivors, no matter how small their voice. And sometimes the truth is spoken in ways we don't expect, through a loyal heart, through instinct, through the growl of a dog who knew something was wrong." before any of us did. Back at home that evening, Emily sat curled up on the living room couch, Max beside her as always. The house was quiet, the front door locked, the windows shut. Safe. Karen came into the room with a mug of cocoa. "Do you want to talk about it, baby?" Emily shook her head. "Not right now." "Okay," her mom said gently. "But if you do, I'm right here." Emily smiled a little, then reached over and placed the mug beside her. She turned to Max and whispered again into his ear. "Safe." That one word had changed everything. She had whispered it after the verdict. She had whispered it at home, in the quiet of her own space. And Max? Max wagged his tail and gave her a soft nudge with his nose. He knew what it meant. He didn't need to speak to understand it. From that night on, Emily never had another nightmare. She still didn't speak often in crowds. But she didn't need to, because wherever she went, Max was right there. At school, at therapy, in the backyard, by her bed at night. And when people asked her how she got through it all, she always said the same thing. "I whispered one word, and he heard me." Sometimes, the smallest voice can unlock the loudest truth. And sometimes, a whisper to a dog can change everything.